Hollywood's Golden Girls. In the 1950s, Hollywood was a machine, and MGM Studios was its crown jewel. This was the era when stars weren't just actors. They were carefully manufactured icons, polished until they sparkled under studio lights. And two of MGM's brightest young stars were Elizabeth Taylor and Debbie Reynolds. Elizabeth Taylor was the very definition of glamour. With her violet eyes, jet black hair, and a beauty that seemed almost unfair, she was marketed as the ultimate movie goddess. By her teenage years, she had already starred in National Velvet and was well on her way to being a global phenomenon.
Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer now presents this most human story of a boy, a girl, and a horse in all the warm tenderness of its modest, unpretentious sincerity.
I'd sooner have that horse happy than go to heaven.
Elizabeth was dramatic, fiery, and magnetic, both on-screen and off. Debbie Reynolds, meanwhile, was positioned as the perfect counterbalance. She was America's sweetheart, wholesome, bubbly, and relatable. Debbie could sing, dance, act, and charm an audience without breaking a sweat. Her breakout role in Singin' in the Rain, 1952, cemented her as the girl next door who represented everything good and pure about post-war America. And Hollywood loved to pair opposites. Elizabeth was the untouchable beauty. Debbie was the girl you'd want to take home to mom. Together, they were presented as two sides of the same golden coin, the studio-approved faces of a glamorous, carefully constructed dream factory. Off-screen, though, the two actresses weren't rivals at first. In fact, they were friends. Debbie once said she looked up to Elizabeth as someone impossibly sophisticated, while Elizabeth enjoyed Debbie's cheerful, no-nonsense nature. They attended the same studio parties, often found themselves in the same social circles, and, as Hollywood gossip columnists love to point out, they seemed like the perfect best friends. It's important to remember, the studio system thrived on image. The public wasn't supposed to see Elizabeth Taylor or Debbie Reynolds as real people with flaws or private struggles. They were Hollywood's golden girls, projected onto the silver screen as flawless examples of beauty and charm. And for a time, they lived up to the image. But behind the sparkle of diamonds and Technicolor musicals, cracks were already forming. Elizabeth Taylor had been married and divorced multiple times by her early 20s. She had a taste for excitement, drama, and danger. Debbie, by contrast, was grounded in tradition, the type who believed in love, marriage, and family. These differences didn't matter much during the early years of their friendship, but soon, when love, tragedy, and betrayal entered the picture, those differences would tear the friendship apart and ignite one of the most infamous feuds in Hollywood history. Because as it turns out, even Golden Girls can tarnish under the bright lights of scandal. Friendship in the spotlight. By the mid-1950s, Elizabeth Taylor and Debbie Reynolds weren't just MGM's prized possessions. They were household names. Every magazine cover, every radio interview, every premiere photo op seemed to feature one or the other, and sometimes both together. Despite their differences in personality, the two actresses genuinely bonded during these years. Debbie, with her sunny optimism and small-town girl charm, found Elizabeth's glamour intoxicating. Elizabeth, who could be intimidatingly beautiful and a little aloof to outsiders, liked Debbie's humor and down-to-earth attitude. Against the backdrop of a ruthless industry where friendships were often transactional, their connection seemed surprisingly real. They weren't just work friends either. The two young women often double-dated, went shopping together, and even joked about the contrast in their images. Debbie later recalled that Elizabeth was the type to drape herself in furs and diamonds for a casual dinner, while Debbie was perfectly fine in a cardigan and flats. It was a friendship that had balance, one dazzling, one approachable, and to the public, it looked like Hollywood's picture-perfect sisterhood. This friendship was also partly practical. In an industry notorious for pitting women against each other, having a close ally mattered. Hollywood tabloids thrived on catfights and feuds, but for a while, Elizabeth and Debbie gave them nothing. They represented stability in an otherwise volatile industry. That stability carried into their love lives, at least on the surface. In 1955, Debbie Reynolds married Eddie Fisher, one of the most popular crooners of the decade. With his boyish looks and smooth voice, Eddie was America's answer to Frank Sinatra. The wedding was a massive Hollywood event, and the union created the ultimate golden couple, the wholesome all-American girl with the charming singing sensation. Elizabeth, on the other hand, was already on her third marriage by the mid-1950s. She had wed British actor Michael Wilding and later fell in love with film producer Mike Todd, a man whose charisma matched her own appetite for drama. Debbie and Elizabeth's double dates often featured the four of them, Debbie with Eddie, Elizabeth with Mike. By all accounts, the group was inseparable. Debbie once described Liz as the other half of my life during those years. They laughed together, raised their kids side by side, and managed the constant circus of celebrity as best friends. For Hollywood fans watching from the outside, it was almost too good to be true. And, as fate would have it, it was. Because when tragedy struck Elizabeth Taylor in 1958, the friendship would take a sharp turn. Debbie rushed in to console her grieving friend, not realizing that this act of kindness would open the door to one of Hollywood's most infamous betrayals. The Reynolds-Fisher Marriage. If Hollywood loved one thing, it was a fairy tale. And Debbie Reynolds marrying Eddie Fisher seemed like one straight out of a studio press release. They tied the knot in 1955, and the timing couldn't have been better. Debbie was fresh off her success in Singin' in the Rain, beloved as America's sweetheart, while Eddie was topping the music charts with hits like Oh My Papa. Together, they were marketed as the perfect couple, beautiful, talented, and squeaky clean. The public ate it up. Magazine spreads showed Debbie and Eddie at home with their two young children, Carrie and Todd Fisher, presenting an image of domestic bliss that rivaled any sitcom family on television. Debbie leaned into that image, admitting in interviews that she wanted a traditional marriage, stability, and a normal family life despite the chaos of Hollywood. But reality didn't always match the glossy covers of photoplay and motion picture. Eddie Fisher, while charming and talented, was also known to be impulsive, restless, and perhaps not ideally suited for the role of faithful husband. Debbie herself later joked that she was so naive, she didn't recognize the red flags fluttering in the wind. Still, for the most part, the marriage functioned, at least until outside forces changed everything. And one of those outside forces was Elizabeth Taylor. At the time, Liz was married to film producer Mike Todd, who was not only larger than life, but also one of Eddie Fisher's closest friends. The four of them often socialized as couples, Debbie and Eddie with Liz and Mike. They represented the pinnacle of Hollywood glamour, and their friendship seemed ironclad. Debbie admired Liz's sophistication, while Liz adored Debbie's wholesome warmth. Elizabeth's tragedy. March 22, 1958. Elizabeth Taylor's life shattered in a single night. Her third husband, producer Mike Todd, had been flying to New York aboard his private plane nicknamed the Liz. Somewhere over New Mexico, the aircraft went down in a fiery crash, killing everyone on board. Elizabeth, just 26 at the time, was left a widow with a young daughter. The loss was devastating. Mike Todd had been the great love of her life, larger than life, charismatic, reckless, and every bit as dramatic as Elizabeth herself. He wasn't just another husband, he was the one she had truly believed in. The grief consumed her. Hollywood responded with a mix of shock and voyeurism. Headlines were splashed across newspapers, fan magazines ran photo spreads of Liz in mourning, and the press tracked her every move. To the outside world, Elizabeth was both a tragic figure and an object of endless fascination. Debbie Reynolds, meanwhile, did exactly what a good friend would do. She went to Elizabeth to console her, she visited, and most importantly, sent Eddie Fisher to Elizabeth's side to keep her company, while she went home to take care of their two young children. Eddie and Mike Todd had been close friends after all. It made sense that Eddie would comfort the grieving widow while Debbie tended to her own family. But grief has a strange way of rewriting boundaries. Elizabeth was vulnerable, lonely, and surrounded by Hollywood sycophants eager to exploit her pain. Eddie, who craved attention and validation, suddenly found himself in the role of savior. What began as late-night phone calls and consoling visits soon blurred into a full-blown affair, one that would detonate not only a marriage, but also one of Hollywood's most cherished friendships. By the end of 1958, whispers had begun to spread. Eddie Fisher wasn't just supporting Elizabeth Taylor, he was in love with her. And Elizabeth, despite her mourning, seemed to reciprocate. The press caught wind quickly, and gossip columnists practically salivated. It was a story too juicy to ignore. America's sweetheart Debbie Reynolds betrayed by her glamorous best friend, Elizabeth Taylor, with none other than her own husband. Debbie, for a time, refused to believe the rumors. She trusted Liz, trusted Eddie, and believed in the carefully curated family life she had built. But Hollywood has a way of stripping away illusions. And soon, what had begun as whispers would become an all-out scandal splashed across front pages around the world. Elizabeth had lost her husband, but in the process, she was about to take her best friends. The scandal. By 1959, the whispers had turned into screaming headlines. Eddie Fisher had left his wife and children for Elizabeth Taylor. Hollywood loved a scandal, and this one had everything: friendship, betrayal, glamour, and heartbreak. Debbie Reynolds, the wholesome girl next door, was suddenly cast as the sympathetic victim. Elizabeth Taylor, meanwhile, became the femme fatale who had seduced her best friend's husband. The tabloids didn't even have to exaggerate, the story sold itself. The betrayal stung all the more because of the way Debbie discovered it. At first, she didn't believe the rumors. She even phoned Liz directly to ask about the gossip. Elizabeth, never one to mince words, replied bluntly, "Well, Eddie is here. Do you want to talk to him?" That was the moment Debbie realized the affair wasn't a rumor. It was real. The press ran wild with the narrative. America's sweetheart betrayed. Liz steals Debbie's man. It was front-page fodder in every magazine and newspaper. Debbie, with her doe-eyed charm and 2 small children at her side, received an outpouring of public sympathy. Elizabeth, once hailed as Hollywood royalty, found herself branded a homewrecker. It didn't help that Liz was unapologetic. In interviews, she defended herself with a now-famous line: "Eddie was going to leave Debbie anyway. What was I supposed to do, let him wander around?" For someone grieving her husband, Elizabeth's bluntness only fueled her image as reckless and self-centered. Eddie Fisher didn't escape unscathed either. He had been one of the most popular singers in America, with his own TV show and legions of fans. But once he left Debbie for Liz, his career began to collapse. Sponsors dropped him, fans booed him, and his family man image crumbled overnight. In a twist of irony, the man at the center of the scandal quickly became the least important player in it. For Debbie, the fallout was brutal but strangely empowering. She was humiliated, yes, but the betrayal only endeared her more to the public. She leaned into her career, played roles that reflected her resilience, and became a symbol of grace under fire. Elizabeth, meanwhile, doubled down, marrying Eddie Fisher in 1959, and trying to move forward as if the scandal hadn't permanently altered her reputation. The affair marked the definitive breaking point of Elizabeth and Debbie's friendship. What had once been Hollywood's favorite sisterhood was now Hollywood's most notorious feud. And while the scandal might have seemed like the climax, in reality, it was only the beginning of a saga that would follow all 3 of them for decades. Because, as it turned out, Elizabeth Taylor didn't exactly plan on keeping Eddie Fisher around for long. Hollywood chooses sides. In the aftermath of Elizabeth Taylor and Eddie Fisher's affair, Hollywood found itself caught in the middle of a very messy custody battle, not over children, but over public sympathy. Debbie Reynolds had the upper hand. She was the wholesome star of Tammy and the Bachelor, the plucky singer-dancer who embodied innocence and charm. With 2 young children and a broken marriage, she fit perfectly into the role of the wronged woman. Fans rallied around her, writing letters of support, and studios saw her as a marketable victim whose resilience only added to her appeal. Elizabeth Taylor, on the other hand, became tabloid dynamite. She was already known for her multiple marriages, her fiery personality, and her taste for high drama. But this affair cemented her reputation as Hollywood's most scandalous leading lady. The press branded her a homewrecker and the other woman. Instead of playing the grieving widow of Mike Todd, Liz was painted as the glamorous vixen who had stolen her best friend's husband. Eddie Fisher, poor Eddie, was collateral damage. His career, which had been white-hot, nosedived. His TV show lost sponsors almost immediately, and audiences booed him during live performances. To many, Eddie wasn't a man swept up in Liz's beauty. He was a coward who had abandoned his wife and children. Hollywood is forgiving of many things, but turning your back on America's sweetheart was not one of them. The industry itself seemed to split. Some insiders defended Liz, insisting she was vulnerable, lonely, and simply seeking comfort after Mike Todd's death. Others sided with Debbie, pointing to Liz's unapologetic interviews as proof that she wasn't sorry for the betrayal. Gossip columnists like Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons feasted on the drama, publishing stories that kept the scandal alive week after week. Publicly, Debbie took the high road. She rarely bad-mouthed Elizabeth or Eddie, instead focusing on her children and career. Privately, however, she admitted the betrayal cut deeply, not only because of Eddie's infidelity, but because it came at the hands of her closest friend. Elizabeth, for her part, seemed unfazed. She married Eddie Fisher in 1959, defiant in the face of criticism. If people disapproved, she didn't seem to care. Liz wasn't interested in being America's sweetheart. She wanted to live on her own terms, regardless of the fallout. And yet, Hollywood has a short memory when it comes to scandal, especially when beauty, talent, and box office power are involved. While Eddie's career all but vanished, Elizabeth would soon land the role that defined her, Cleopatra. And in true Elizabeth Taylor fashion, her next scandal was already waiting on the horizon. Because the affair with Eddie Fisher was explosive, yes, but it was nothing compared to what would happen when Elizabeth Taylor met Richard Burton. Aftermath: Fisher and Taylor's short-lived romance. Elizabeth Taylor and Eddie Fisher's marriage in 1959 was supposed to be the happy ending to a messy love triangle. But in true Hollywood fashion, it was anything but. From the beginning, their relationship was built on shaky ground. Eddie had abandoned Debbie Reynolds and their 2 children in a very public scandal, and Elizabeth was still grieving the loss of Mike Todd. They may have walked down the aisle, but the marriage was less about true love and more about circumstance. 2 people clinging to each other in the chaos of their own making. Public opinion didn't soften after the wedding. Eddie's career, once promising, was in ruins. He went from hosting a hit television show to scrambling for work. Audiences who once adored him now jeered, unable to forgive his betrayal of Debbie. Elizabeth, meanwhile, managed to keep her career intact thanks to her sheer star power. No scandal was big enough to eclipse those violet eyes. Still, even Liz seemed restless. Eddie, by most accounts, was no Mike Todd. He was dependable in some ways, but he lacked the charisma, ambition, and fire that had drawn Liz to her late husband. As the years passed, their marriage looked less like a Hollywood love story and more like a faded headline. Then came Cleopatra. In 1961, Elizabeth landed the role of Cleopatra in what would become one of the most expensive and infamous films ever made. The production was a disaster, plagued by delays, budget overruns, and endless press scrutiny. But the real story wasn't the movie itself. It was Elizabeth's on-set romance with her co-star, Richard Burton. Their chemistry was undeniable, and soon Eddie Fisher was once again playing the role of the man left behind. In 1962, Liz left Eddie for Richard, sparking yet another international scandal. One so big it even caught the attention of the Vatican, which condemned the affair as erotic vagrancy. By then, Eddie Fisher had become little more than a footnote. He faded from the spotlight, his career irreparably damaged. Debbie Reynolds, meanwhile, was thriving. She had weathered the storm, kept her dignity, and now stood in stark contrast to Eddie's decline. The Eddie Fisher chapter of Elizabeth Taylor's life was short-lived, more of a bridge between tragedies and triumphs than a lasting love story. But its impact on her friendship with Debbie Reynolds was permanent. The betrayal had driven a wedge between them that seemed impossible to repair. And yet, as Hollywood loves a good twist, this feud wasn't destined to stay icy forever. Because decades later, against all odds, Elizabeth Taylor and Debbie Reynolds would find a way to reconcile, and even laugh about the scandal that once defined them. Debbie rebuilds. While Elizabeth Taylor moved on to Richard Burton and a new cycle of tabloid drama, Debbie Reynolds faced the fallout of betrayal with grit and determination. If Liz was Hollywood's scandal magnet, Debbie became Hollywood's survivor. After Eddie Fisher walked out, Debbie was left with 2 young children, Carrie and Todd Fisher, and the daunting task of maintaining both her career and her dignity in the middle of a media circus. Public sympathy was firmly on her side, but sympathy doesn't pay the bills. Debbie had to work, and she threw herself into it. Her career, far from crumbling, actually flourished. In 1964, she earned an Academy Award nomination for The Unsinkable Molly Brown, playing a role that mirrored her own resilience, a woman who refused to be defeated by circumstances. The performance wasn't just acting, it was life imitating art. Debbie embodied grit, optimism, and the ability to bounce back when the odds were stacked against her. Financially, she wasn't always so lucky. Debbie had a habit of trusting the wrong people with her money, and she was burned by poor business deals more than once. But every setback seemed to showcase her tenacity. Whether performing in films, on stage in Las Vegas, or later touring with her own act, she proved that her career longevity wasn't tied to any man. It was tied to her own work ethic and talent. Debbie also leaned into her public image as the wronged woman, but with a twist. She didn't wallow in it. Instead, she used humor to disarm the scandal. She made jokes at her own expense, quipping that Eddie Fisher's affair had been a really bad business decision on his part. That ability to laugh at tragedy kept audiences rooting for her long after the headlines faded. Meanwhile, her children became her anchor. Carrie Fisher would go on to become a Hollywood icon herself, but in the 1960s and 70s, Debbie was focused on raising her family and providing a sense of stability. Unlike Elizabeth, who seemed to thrive on chaos, Debbie embraced normalcy wherever she could find it. Over time, the scandal that had rocked Hollywood began to lose its edge. Debbie's enduring career and likable persona overshadowed the betrayal, while Eddie Fisher slid further into obscurity. Elizabeth Taylor, of course, remained a superstar, but her reputation as Hollywood's man-stealer lingered. For Debbie, rebuilding wasn't just about career survival, it was about reclaiming her identity. She was no longer defined solely as Eddie Fisher's wife or Elizabeth Taylor's betrayed friend. She was Debbie Reynolds, actress, singer, mother, and a woman who had faced one of Hollywood's messiest scandals and come out the other side stronger. And yet, despite everything, the feud with Elizabeth wasn't truly finished. Because years later, the 2 women who had once been inseparable friends, and then bitter enemies, would be brought back together in one of Hollywood's most unexpected reconciliations. Reconciliation. For years, the Elizabeth Taylor-Debbie Reynolds feud simmered quietly in the background of Hollywood. They weren't throwing drinks at each other at parties or exchanging barbed words in the press. Instead, they did what many people do after a painful betrayal. They kept their distance. Elizabeth married and divorced Richard Burton twice, as well as several other husbands. Debbie also remarried 2 more times, raised her children, navigated financial hardships, and carved out a second career as a beloved stage performer. They were both busy living their own complicated lives, and for decades the idea of reconciliation seemed impossible. But time has a funny way of dulling even the sharpest wounds. By the 1980s, Elizabeth and Debbie had grown older, wiser, and perhaps a little weary of carrying the weight of a feud that had long since passed its expiration date. The turning point reportedly came thanks to Carrie Fisher, Debbie's daughter, who encouraged her mother to reach out and let go of the bitterness. And so, after more than 2 decades of estrangement, Debbie and Elizabeth reconnected. To the surprise of many, their reunion wasn't awkward or icy. It was genuine. Debbie later recalled that they laughed about the whole scandal, as though it were just another chapter in the wild, unpredictable story of their lives. The reconciliation was more than symbolic. They began making public appearances together, sometimes poking fun at the feud that had once defined them. In 2001, they even co-starred in the TV movie These Old Broads, written by none other than Carrie Fisher. The film, which also featured Shirley MacLaine and Joan Collins, leaned into the idea of aging divas with complicated pasts, art imitating life, but with a wink to the audience. Elizabeth, for her part, admitted in later years that she felt guilt over what had happened. Debbie, always the optimist, forgave her. The two women realized that they had far more in common than they once thought. They had both been used by Hollywood, both endured heartbreak, and both survived decades in an industry notorious for chewing people up. By the end of their lives, Elizabeth and Debbie had restored the bond they once shared as young starlets in the 1950s. Their reconciliation didn't erase the scandal, but it reframed it. Instead of being remembered solely as bitter enemies, they became examples of how even the most famous feuds can find closure. Elizabeth passed away in 2011 at the age of 79. Debbie followed just a few years later in 2016. She was 84 years old. Debbie died the very next day after her daughter Carrie Fisher died. Legacy of the feud. The feud between Elizabeth Taylor and Debbie Reynolds has become one of Hollywood's defining scandals, a story that has outlived the careers of both women and still fascinates audiences decades later. Part of its staying power lies in the contrast between the two stars. Debbie Reynolds was the all-American sweetheart, the woman who believed in love, family, and stability. Elizabeth Taylor was the glamorous icon who lived boldly, unapologetically, and often recklessly. When their friendship imploded over Eddie Fisher, the public saw it as a morality play, good girl versus temptress, and the tabloids milked that narrative for all it was worth. But the legacy is more complicated than that. Elizabeth Taylor was never just a homewrecker, and Debbie Reynolds was never just a victim. Both women were products of a ruthless studio system that controlled their images and thrived on sensationalism. Hollywood built them up as perfect ideals, and then tore them down when real life didn't match the fantasy. The scandal also reflected changing times. In the 1950s, stars were expected to maintain spotless reputations. By the 1960s and beyond, scandal became part of the business model. Elizabeth's career survived precisely because audiences couldn't look away, no matter how outrageous her personal life became. Debbie's career, meanwhile, flourished because she embodied resilience, the woman who could be humiliated and heartbroken, yet come back stronger every time. Their eventual reconciliation gave the story an unexpected twist. Instead of remaining bitter enemies, they chose to laugh about the past and move forward. In doing so, they took control of their own narrative, no longer defined by a man who, ironically, became the least relevant figure in the entire saga. Eddie Fisher may have been the spark, but Elizabeth and Debbie were the fire. In the end, the Elizabeth Taylor-Debbie Reynolds feud wasn't just about betrayal. It was about image versus reality, friendship tested by tragedy, and two women navigating the treacherous world of fame. Both came out the other side with scars, yes, but also with legacies that transcended the scandal. And if nothing else, the feud gave Hollywood exactly what it craved most: a story so dramatic, so glamorous, and so painfully human that people are still talking about it more than 60 years later. Because in Hollywood, scandals fade, stars dim, but legendary feuds, those live forever.